Good afternoon. One of the things that, obviously, we just heard from Vitruvian is a series of systems that are required, obviously, to start to manage the commercialization of this complex supply chain. And so we focus on it from a little bit different perspective. Our focus is obviously on ensuring that these materials can move around the world and get out to and from site of administration and interact with the manufacturing sites themselves. And so what we're going to talk a little bit about is the science behind logistics itself. And so, Cryoport is currently supporting around 95 of these programs in the regenerative therapy space. And so we think that we have a little bit of critical mass in which to, start to look at this from an evaluative standpoint. We are growing, 75% average compound annual growth rate over the last 3 years. It's a small number, but the number is growing rapidly. We're currently supporting about 20% of the phase 3 trials in this space, and we believe that is an area that differentiates us. We're currently actually working with about 6 different partners in regards to commercial launch discussions and the complexities involved in all of the different components that tie into this. One of the things that we do is we have a very unique technology platform as well, and it's called what we call our Cryoportal. And this system itself has the ability to integrate into a lot of other software platforms, whether it's an overlaying manufacturing platform similar to what Vitruvian was just talking about, whether it's logistics competencies like a informatics system that a FedEx would have or a specialty carrier, whether it's a patient management or reimbursement process through a 3PL or a hub services model, or even into storage, a long-term biorepository, and other elements along those lines. And having the ability to carefully integrate those aspects together and manage that in a supply chain is something that we've really focused on. And we've actually managed about 140,000 shipments in this space in about 100 countries over the last 5 years. So we think that gives us a good base from which to work on. So this shows you the ramp in this space, and I think this reflects, obviously everybody's optimism in this in regenerative therapy itself. We're currently supporting just under 100 clinical trials. This number is very, very rapidly increasing. We believe that number will probably be closer to 130 trials by the end of the year. And, we're on average onboarding 3 to 4 trials a month at this point in time. So lots of optimism to work from. And you can see the distribution in regards to phase. And so, we focus obviously on trying to have folks think through the logistics aspects of a clinical program as early as possible, because it actually goes back to even simple things, relatively, such as, what is your primary packaging going to look like for moving your product out? Is it a plug bag? Is it a vial? All of these things have a critical importance in regards to looking at cost of goods when you move towards commercialization, and it may have impacts in regards to how you approach that. We rely on 3 primary areas of our business. Area 1 is packaging, and packaging consists of, in most cases in this space, either an inbound apheresis product, which could be at 2 to 8. Could be at room temperature, it could be cryogenic, and an outbound, cell product itself, and also all of the surrogate material that's being moved around from a quality standpoint, whether it's a biomarker, critical reagent, and other elements. And we feel that all of those have to be critically evaluated for, the impact of logistics on the resultant data that's being generated to support that trial. We have an information technology piece, which we'll talk a little bit more on, and then a significant logistics expertise. And all of these things are interwoven in a very, very close-knit manner in which to drive intelligent, data-driven decisions on how we're supporting clinical programs. And this complexity, obviously, folks have shown many different renditions of this over the years. This is our current, rendition that we show, and when we sit down and kind of walk through it. But there's obviously a physical component, and that physical component is, the moving of the material around the world, whether it's inbound material, outbound material, research material, support elements, critical reagents, et cetera. But there's also a significant data component. And the ability to correlate a given logistics impact on that is not only a physical asset, but it's a data asset. And you have to be able to understand both and the impact of one on the other. And that's one of the things that we really focus on here. In particular, our informatics systems, the way that they're built, we can actually correlate a definitive transportation-related event, whether it's a shock event, an orientation event, a delay, customs, weather-related, to the impact of that material itself. So if you take a look at the market, it's just taking a more of a macro look here. And this is data that's derived obviously from ARM as well as some others. From our estimation at this point, this market itself is currently supporting about $1.16 billion in logistics spend only. So this kind of gives you understanding of the value of dollars that are being spent on the logistics piece. But we think it goes deeper than that, because we think the entire $17 billion that's being generated in this space just from the top folks alone is also in play. If we don't have adequate and appropriate logistics decisions, you may impact the R&D and the quality of that data that's being generated. And so that's the way that we view this and take it that seriously. Driving a little bit deeper, this is our understanding of how this breaks down into the three areas that we talked about: packaging, logistics, and informatics. And there's a fourth leg of that stool, obviously biostorage, which I'm not going to spend any time on, but also has an equally important consideration when you're looking at your overall product and material flow. So we actually approach this from a scientific perspective. From a packaging standpoint, we really work to understand the impact of the packaging and temperature choices on sample integrity. And we'll talk just a very, very brief bit around some of the data that we've been generating, looking at transportation studies and their impact on biomarkers, as well as some active clinical material by somebody in this space. And we actually approach our fleet management, and so that's a critical aspect here. We approach the equipment basis that's being used to move these materials around the world almost by a QBD format. Everything that we have in our systems is requalified every single time it's used, so we have the performance characteristics of that in real time. And this is really, really important in regards to minimizing the risk profile of that particular equipment and how it's being used. If it's done in a static format where you're just doing a qualification or validation once every 6, 12, 18 months, we've seen that can contribute to a significant failure rate ultimately in how that equipment is used and ultimately what the resultant outcome on the material that's being moved within that. We also leverage our systems and our informatics on our cryoportal basis. We have a tremendous amount of data in that. So we can actually map out based on a carrier-specific basis what their performance criteria are on-time delivery, failure rates, cost, and a whole host of other elements, and make non-biased assessments on who to use for what particular lanes to obviously risk mitigate based on a carrier basis. And we also have the ability to do a lot of planning and reporting, so we can actually look at their performance against what their stated data indicates and give you an unbiased assessment on what that performance actually looks like. So very, very briefly on a packaging basis, there's data in there, and limited data out there that says that packaging choice can have an impact on obviously the material that's in there. And so we actually have conducted a study looking at deep cold chain, dry ice versus cryogenic, looking at biomarkers and cell therapies and the impact on that data, on those products themselves. If it will advance for me. There we go. Can you go back one slide, please? Or 2 slides? One more. Oh, okay. Forward one. There we go. Oh. Can we go back? There. No, now we're losing it. This stopped working. We have another one? One more. Forward one, please. There we go. So as I mentioned, we take it very seriously looking at the impact of packaging on the product integrity itself. And so these are actually temperature mapping studies dynamically looking at the 3 different formats. And you can see there's actually a significant amount of variation in the performance of these different transport media. And this is one element that we consider when we look at making recommendations on how to transport material. You want to go to the next slide, please? In addition, when you're moving product, one of the other things that we've seen in the literature is there is a resultant potential impact on pH and pH shifts due to packaging that's actually transported using dry ice. And we've actually seen this data supported in our dynamic studies themselves. However, in subsequent data that I'm not showing here, we actually looked at the impact and see if there's a direct correlation on performance of the materials that are being moved and that shift in pH, and we did not see a direct correlation. But that is something that others have shown may have an impact on performance of certain assays and other aspects along those lines. Next slide, please. And you can also see here, obviously, temperature deviation and the impact on this, in this particular case, biomarker recovery. So what we're seeing here is a direct correlation in that thermal variation that we showed a few slides ago, based on packaging decision and what that resultant output is on the quality of the data that's being generated. Next slide, please. And this gives you an overall summary of that data itself, looking at a 30-plex of biomarkers. And you can see the variability here in regards to different transport media utilized. Next slide, please. And we also see the same thing. This is actually a part of that study that was done jointly in conjunction with Heat Biologics. And this is their impact allogeneic cancer vaccine. And you can see the resultant recovery rates and viability on their cells that were transported using cryoshippers versus dry ice. Next slide. So as I'd mentioned, logistics is another consideration, and we do a lot of tracking here. We look at carrier performance. We look at things like turnaround time, which have a direct impact on capital cost being used to support a given commercial launch or clinical program itself. We look at their experience in the marketplace, so we can actually see who has that experience itself. And you can see this particular case, there's certain specialties and other integrators that have substantial experience benefits over others in this space, as well as on-time performance. Next slide. But the bottom line is, regardless what carrier you use, everything that we've seen in network gets handled very, very poorly. And we have to account for this, So you'll have a specialty carrier that'll come to you and say, "Look, we can keep this upright. We can hand carry this thing from point A to point B." The bottom line is the data doesn't support it, and you have to be able to correlate these types of impacts with that product quality. Next slide. So you can see here, on average, and regardless of container type, these things are turned upside down, sideways, a significant proportion of their transit life cycle. Next. So what we do is we actually have developed a significant informatics system that feeds back into our informatics software that will provide the ability for us to understand the impact of those transit-related elements that we were just showing you on the product integrity. So you can see here our data management do full-time GPS, geofencing, internal temperature, external humidity, pressure, shock, tilt, as well as a couple of other things. And I'll show you on the next slide very quickly here. We can actually understand and use our systems to proactively respond to a trigger event. So what you can see on the very far upper left-hand side on this slide is an actual shock event. This was actually a 34G shock event, which itself, if you look at the temperature mapping, didn't have anything obvious. But what we can actually do is, based on the correlation of that shock event with the orientation data, the pressure data, and the internal and external temperature, we can actually tell that there was a product integrity failure here. And now the clock starts ticking. We have an 8-hour window in which to save the product, in this particular instance, from failure before that dewar starts to warm. And the fact that we can actually proactively understand these alerts, they actually go into an escalation process within our systems and our teamwork. Our customer service teams can actually step in and provide an option to intercede to prevent that product failure. And obviously this is extremely critical in an autologous therapy where you have absolutely no means by which to replicate the material itself in many cases. And so this is the way that we're trying to use informatics and data to reduce and manage that risk profile. And this is something that we're continuing to develop and build out. And we think it's a significant advantage for the marketplace as we go toward commercial launches on a lot of these programs. Next slide. So just to summarize very quickly, we believe that packaging and logistics decisions are extremely critical. We recommend that you engage folks that are involved in this, even in your planning process, to start your phase 1 trials. Don't wait to phase 2 or phase 3, because a lot of those decisions have not only an impact on product integrity, but also on cost of goods long term. We do believe that poor decision and choices on regards to logistics methodology here can actually impact your clinical trial and obviously your clinical trial spend themselves. And we think that this is a powerful tool informatics can be, in particular on the logistics side, to support your decision-making, in particular strategic decision-making and how to operate and support these trials long term. I think that's it. Next slide. So I appreciate it. Thank you.